step into a world of imagination where science meets mystery. On this channel, HFY Stories, you'll experience exciting sci-fi stories about futuristic worlds, space adventures, advanced technology, and unexpected twists. Every story is told in a natural human voice, not AI generated, to give you a more real and engaging storytelling experience. If you love immersive sci-fi tales and powerful storytelling, you're in the right place. Let's start the story.
They said the Valthari Academy had never lost a cadet to drop out. They were wrong about what that meant. The ones who left didn't quit. They were carried out. And then a human girl applied. The Valthari didn't build their academy on a planet. That would have been too forgiving. Too, as their senior Archon Serevos once put it, in that particular tone of his that made lesser species want to fold themselves into the nearest wall. Terrestrial. Bound. Comfortable in all the wrong ways. They built it on a station strapped to the outer shell of a dying star. Not metaphorically dying. Actually dying. Karath 9 was a red giant in its final estimated 4,000-year contraction, which to a Valthari meant there was a perfectly acceptable window of use remaining. To every other species in the conclave, it meant the Academy existed in a slow and constant ambient scream of radiation and gravitational fluctuation that made the air taste like copper, and the floors hum at a frequency that rattled unprotected bone marrow. The Valthari, of course, had no bone marrow. Their skeletal matrix was carbon-threaded ceramic, grown rather than built, and their nervous systems processed pain signals through a secondary buffer that functioned less like a warning system and more like interesting data. This was the first thing that made them extraordinary soldiers. The second was that they had been doing this, training, selecting, culling, refining, for 11,000 years without interruption. 11,000 years of turning the most capable bodies from 24 species into something the Conclave had no clean word for. Not warriors. That word implied a beginning and an end, a piece before and after. What the Valthari made were continuations, living proof that the galaxy's harshest pressures produced, if you were patient enough, something unbreakable. Their graduation rate was 6%, not 6% per class, 6% total, across 11,000 years. The ones who failed didn't always die, though enough did that the Academy kept a wall of names in the entry corridor that had long since needed a second wall, then a third. Most simply broke in ways that didn't show on the outside. They came home quieter. They stopped finishing sentences. They looked at sunsets and flinched. Every species in the conclave considered it the highest honor to send their best to Valthari. Every species also privately held memorial services before their candidates left, because hope and pragmatism were not mutually exclusive. Humanity had been in the conclave for 43 years. In those 43 years, they had been invited to exactly nothing involving Valthari. This was not an oversight. It was a consensus, held politely but unanimously across 14 member species, that humans were. The diplomatic phrasing changed depending on who you asked, but the meaning didn't. Not ready. Too new. Too fragile. Too loud and sentimental, and liable to make the kind of decisions during high-stress training that ended careers or ended other people. The conclave gave humanity agricultural exchange programs, cultural appreciation delegations, carefully supervised observation posts at medium importance installations. They did not give humanity Valthari. And then Zara Ose submitted her application. She had printed it out. On paper. Actual paper, which she'd apparently sourced from her family's small publishing company on Earth. Thick cream stock with a slight texture that cost more per sheet than most species' entire application processes. She had written the cover letter by hand, in Valthari primary script, which was not a language humans were supposed to have access to, let alone be able to render in the specific angular calligraphy that the Academy's founding documents were written in. Archon Serevos held the paper for a very long time. He was not the kind of creature who showed uncertainty. He was 2 meters of carbon ceramic architecture in a uniform that had been pressed by a machine that knew how to press uniforms better than most beings knew how to do anything. His eyes were pale, almost colorless, with pupils that expanded and contracted not based on light, but based on cognitive load. When he was thinking hard, they went nearly black. They went nearly black looking at the paper. She included references, said Vice Archon Dhala, reading from her screen with the particular flatness of someone trying not to have a reaction. Dhala was Sorvai, 3-armed, low-gravity born, with a face that had evolved over millions of years specifically to communicate nothing to predators. It was communicating something now. 11 references. 4 of them are conclave military officers of grade 7 or above. One is the Kashari ambassador to Earth. Ambassador Velthan sponsored a human applicant. He wrote, and I will read this exactly as submitted, that she was, quote, the most dangerous thing he had encountered in 40 years of diplomatic service, and that he meant this as the highest possible recommendation. Dhala set the screen down. He also noted that she had arm-wrestled his security attaché and won, but that this was ancillary. Serevos turned the paper over. The back was blank, except for one line, also in primary script. I don't need you to believe I can do this. I need you to let me prove it. She's 24, Dhala said. By human reckoning, their species' average lifespan is approximately 80 years, which means she is in the first third of her life. By their own metrics, barely past juvenile classification. Serevos said nothing for a while. Outside the window of his office, if you could call the reinforced observation glass a window, it was more accurately a monument to engineering stubbornness in the face of Kareth-9's opinion of all things structural. The star pulsed, slow, patient, dying on its own schedule. Pull her file, he said. The file was unusual in ways that files about 24-year-old humans from a species 43 years out of their home system probably shouldn't be. Zara Osei had grown up on Earth in a city called Accra, in a region called Ghana, in a nation that had spent 3 centuries learning something about the particular texture of being underestimated by larger powers and deciding, 1 generation at a time, to convert that experience into fuel. Her family had been booksellers for 4 generations. Her mother ran the publishing company. Her father taught physics at a university. Her grandmother, who was 91 and apparently still very much forming opinions about things, had been part of the first generation of humans to attend conclave cultural exchange programs. She had been studying Valthari primary script since she was 14. She had started applying to the academy at 19, 1 year before the minimum age threshold. The rejection had been form-generated, automated, not even routed to a live administrator. She had applied again at 20, at 21, at 22, at 23, each application more refined than the last, each one demonstrating a deeper understanding of Valthari training methodology, combat theory, and academy culture than most of the candidates they accepted from established member species. Each rejection had been form-generated. She had never complained, never escalated through conclave diplomatic channels, never made noise. She just kept going. Human persistence, Dhala said, reading the behavioral notation attached to the file. It's documented. Their pain tolerance is anomalous for a species of their physical class. Their capacity to continue functioning under extended duress doesn't degrade on the standard curve. It appears to plateau, and their emotional processing, while extremely high volume compared to... She applied 5 times. Yes, she expected to be rejected 5 times and came back anyway. That appears to be accurate. Serevos turned the paper over 1 more time. Read the last line again. I don't need you to believe I can do this. He was not a creature given to intuition. He made decisions based on data, pattern recognition, and 11,000 years of academy precedent. But there was something at the edge of his thinking that didn't have a clean category, and it was this: that in 11,000 years of training, the galaxy's finest, He had never once received an application on cream paper in handwritten primary script from a species that shouldn't have known it existed, from a person who had been told no 5 times and treated that as a scheduling problem. "Admit her," he said. Thaler's pupils went wide. Archon. As a provisional candidate, standard probationary conditions. First cycle evaluation applies. The other species will note that we received an application that met all stated criteria and chose not to discriminate on the basis of species origin. He set the paper down on his desk, aligning it precisely with the edge. And they will say nothing else, because they know our criteria do not include, "We don't think you can do it." Thaler was quiet for a moment. She may not survive orientation. Many candidates don't survive orientation. She's human. She's a candidate. He looked at the paper one last time. Send her admission documents. Standard package. No accommodations. Zara read the admission letter 3 times before she believed it. Then she sat on the floor of her family's bookshop, between the shelves of translated Kashari poetry and the rack of star chart folios her mother stocked because they sold surprisingly well. And she breathed. Just breathed. The shop smelled the way it always had. Paper and old binding glue and the particular warm dust smell of rooms where people had spent a long time thinking quietly. And she sat in it and let herself have exactly 4 minutes of something she didn't have a precise name for. Her grandmother found her there. Nana Adwa was 91, used a cane for navigating uneven ground, but had declared on multiple occasions that she would use it for navigating other people if pushed, and had eyes that had been watching the world do surprising things for nearly a century, and still found it interesting. She looked at Zara on the floor. She looked at the letter in Zara's hand. "They said yes," Nana Adwa said. "They said yes." Her grandmother sat down on the floor beside her, which took a moment and involved a soft commentary of joint-related opinions. And then she put her hand over Zara's. "Good," she said. "Now, are you scared?" Zara thought about this honestly. "Yes." "Good," her grandmother said again. "Scared means you understand what's in front of you. Brave is just scared with somewhere to be." Zara looked at the letter. The Academy seal at the top, the Vailthari sigil, which translated loosely as "what survives the forge," was printed in a colour that wasn't quite silver and wasn't quite black, the same colour as the star they'd built the station around. "I've been preparing for 6 years," Zara said. "I know the training structure, the early elimination protocols, the caloric requirements under heavy gravity simulation. I've done everything I can do from here. I know. I'm still scared." Her grandmother squeezed her hand. 6 years is a long time to prepare for a thing that might kill you." "Yes. Which means you've had 6 years of deciding it was worth it." She tapped the letter once with one finger. "That decision is already made. What's in front of you is just the doing of it." Zara folded the letter carefully, tucked it into her jacket pocket, where it sat against her ribs like a warm, waiting thing. "I'll write," she said. "You'd better." Her grandmother started the process of getting back up, which involved the cane and commentary. "And don't let them think small things about you. You hear me? Whatever they think you are, you be something they don't have a word for yet." The transport to Kareth 9 held 41 candidates. Zara was the only human. She'd known this intellectually. She hadn't fully understood it until the moment she walked into the staging bay on Conclave Station Vel 7 and felt 40 sets of non-human eyes perform the same quiet calculation. Some were polite about it. A Kashari candidate, tall, pale-scaled, with the kind of build that made structural engineers feel personally inadequate, looked at her for exactly 2 seconds and then looked away, which was the Kashari equivalent of a full and respectful acknowledgement. A pair of Dravathi candidates, squat and dense-boned, designed by evolutionary heritage for the kinds of pressures that turned rock into other rock, didn't look away. They just watched her with the patient, slightly puzzled expression of people watching a domestic animal wander onto a running track. One creature, she had to look up the species tag on her conclave band, Torresi, a deep-water origin, bioluminescent secondary skin, leaned toward its companion and said something in Teresi that her translator rendered, a beat late, as, "Do they know they sent the wrong one?" Zara heard it, kept walking, found a seat near the transport window and strapped in. The Kashari candidate sat down 2 seats away. He was the only other person on the transport sitting alone. Velkas, he said. His name, she assumed. Kashari often skipped introductory framing. Names were load-bearing on their own. Zara Ose. She extended her hand, which he examined for a moment. Handshaking was not universal. And then gripped once, carefully, with about 40% of the force he was capable of, which was still enough to feel like shaking hands with a hydraulic press. "You've studied the academy," he said. It wasn't a question. 6 years. He processed this. Teresi candidates train from childhood. The Drovathi have a pre-academy program. Most Kashari spend 3 years in preparation courses. I know. You are aware your preparation window is shorter. Also aware that preparation windows don't graduate you. She turned to look out the window at the docking bay outside, at the slow traffic of conclave vessels, at the particular emptiness of deep space beyond the station's edge. The exam does. Velkas was quiet for a moment. Then, and she wasn't sure if she was reading the Kashari equivalent of an expression correctly, but she thought she was, the corner of his scale plate shifted. Something like approval, maybe. Or something like interesting. "The Teresi candidate behind you," he said, very quietly, has a secondary nervous system that allows him to process pain input as directional data. The Drovathi pair have bone density 3 times the conclave humanoid standard. I can generate localized bioelectric charge sufficient to stop a standard-grade cardiac system. Zara looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you will fight all of us before the first cycle ends. That is how the academy works." He looked straight ahead. "I thought you should know what you're walking into." She thought about her grandmother on the floor of the bookshop. Brave is just scared with somewhere to be. "I know what I'm walking into," she said. The transport unlocked from the dock with a deep mechanical thud, and Kareth 9 appeared in the window. The dying star, orange-red and immense and patient, and with the academy station strapped to its outer shell like a thing that had decided to argue with a god and hadn't lost yet. Zara pressed her hand flat against the glass. Her palm left a print that fogged the surface in the exact shape of a human hand. She didn't look away until the star filled the whole window. Orientation at the Valthari Academy lasted 12 days. Not 12 days with rest periods. Not 12 days broken up by meals and recovery windows. 12 days of continuous evaluation, which the Academy's documentation described as the initial filtration sequence in the same neutral tone one might describe a water treatment process, and which was, Zara understood immediately upon arrival, specifically designed to strip candidates down to whatever they actually were before the training had a chance to hide it. The station received them in a bay that was pressurized higher than conclave standard. Nothing dangerous, just enough to notice a constant low-grade compression that made deep breathing feel like an argument. The lighting was set slightly wrong, slightly too far into the infrared for human eyes, which meant Zara was navigating by a dim, orange-tinged version of the world, while everyone else was moving with full visual clarity. The floors hummed at 17 Hz, just below the threshold of human audibility, but well within the range that started a slow negotiation with the inner ear's balance systems. All of this was by design. The first night, she didn't sleep. Not because she couldn't, but because she chose not to. She lay in the candidate dormitory. Individual bays, minimal. The kind of minimalism that wasn't aesthetic but functional, every object having been removed until only the necessary remained. And she ran through what she knew. She knew the Academy's 12-cycle training structure. She knew orientation was designed to identify candidates who broke under environmental pressure before the structured curriculum began. She knew the first elimination event would occur within 72 hours of arrival. She knew the Valthari considered data collection the highest form of preparation. Not strategy, not strength training, but observation, understanding a system before attempting to move through it. She also knew that none of that knowledge had ever been tested under 17 Hertz and wrong spectrum light and 300 consecutive days away from everything familiar. She did the math that she'd been avoiding doing. The math that lived in the back of her head in the shape of a question she'd been answering with forward motion for 6 years. 63 candidates, current class, 6% graduation rate historically. That was 3.5 people. Rounding generously, 4. Velkas, she thought. The Kashari candidate was the only one she'd assessed as definitely making it. The two Dravathi were physically extraordinary, but she'd watched them in the transport. Competent, confident, slightly too comfortable in their competence. Comfort was the thing the Academy was built to remove. The Torresi who'd made the comment about the wrong candidate had a nervous system built for pain processing. That was a significant advantage. Also, she'd noticed he'd adjusted his seating position 4 times during the transit, which suggested a proprioception sensitivity that might not hold up under the floor frequency. She'd been cataloguing everyone in the transport the whole time, not because she was strategic in a cold or manipulative way, but because she had always been since childhood, since the bookshop, since all those years of sitting in the corner reading things she wasn't supposed to have access to yet, constitutionally incapable of being in a room without understanding it. Her mother called it relentless. Her grandmother called it the thing that would either save her or exhaust everyone around her. The Academy called it nothing yet. The Academy didn't know she existed as a person yet. She was a provisional candidate, file number 9-Zara-Osei-Human. And the next 12 days would decide whether she got a name here or a form letter. She closed her eyes. Didn't sleep. Catalogued. The first elimination event was a navigation exercise through the Academy's maintenance tunnels, a network of passages that ran through the station's inner shell and were, the briefing document cheerfully noted, not mapped in any format accessible to candidates. The goal: reach the designated point. Time limit: unspecified. Secondary condition: delivered by a training officer with the affect of someone reading a grocery list. The tunnels were intermittently flooded with a disorientation agent in aerosol form, which would be clearly marked by, the officer paused here, no markings whatsoever, because in genuine field conditions, nothing was marked. The agent caused, in most known species, a 15 to 30-minute window of profound spatial confusion. Not hallucination, just a complete decoupling of the sense of where the body was in relation to everything else. Proprioception, offline. Balance, negotiating with itself. Spatial memory, unreliable. Several candidates, the officer noted, had historically resolved this event by waiting the agent out. This approach was not disqualifying. It was noted. They went in 2-minute intervals, solo. Zara went in 8th. The tunnels were dark in the way that only enclosed metal spaces could be dark. Not just the absence of light, but the presence of something else. A particular quality of sound and material that told you the walls were close even before you touched them. She went slowly at first, methodically, trailing her right hand along the wall to maintain orientation, counting steps, noting air temperature differentials that indicated ventilation junctions, using the floor frequency, still present here, vibrating up through her boots, as a constant reference point. She hit the disorientation agent at what she estimated was 40 meters in. No warning, no smell, just the world sliding sideways. She stopped, sat down on the floor, which was a decision she'd made in advance. Vertical orientation was the first thing to go, and fighting it standing up was a losing argument. She sat. She put both palms flat on the floor. She felt the 17 Hertz hum moving up through her hands. The hum didn't change. Whatever else was happening to her vestibular system, the hum was constant. She closed her eyes, already closed, effectively, in the dark, and she mapped the tunnel by what she'd felt on the way in. Wall on her right. Junction 4 meters back, lower temperature from the right. Air moving from ahead, which meant the tunnel continued ahead, and something at the far end was circulating it, The disorientation peaked. Her inner ear was filing a formal complaint with her cerebellum. The floor felt tilted when she knew it wasn't. She kept both palms down, kept counting the hum. She had read, in a xenobiology text that had no reason to be in her mother's publishing archive, but was, because her mother had a theory that you never knew what might matter, that human proprioceptive recovery time under chemical disorientation was faster than most bipedal species. Not faster than Valthari, but faster than the conclave average. Something about the density of mechanoreceptors in the palms and feet. An evolutionary artifact from a species that climbed things and needed to know exactly where its hands were at all times. She had read this at 16 and filed it under useful someday. Someday was now. She waited, counted the hum. At what she estimated was 18 minutes, shorter than the standard 15 to 30 window, which she'd mentally flagged as a data point to verify later, she stood up, slowly, both palms still touching the wall. Then she kept moving. She came out of the tunnels in what turned out to be the second fastest completion time of the event. Fastest was Velkas, who had apparently navigated the entire thing using his bioelectric field as a proximity sensor, and had, in his words when she found him in the assembly area, "I found the disorientation agent interesting." Second was Zara. Third through seventh were a spread of Sorvai, Kashari, and one of the Drovathi. The other Drovathi was still in the tunnels when the time limit elapsed. The Torresi candidate, who had made the wrong candidate comment, came out 12 minutes after Zara, visibly shaken in the particular way that bioluminescent species showed stress. His secondary skin had gone irregular, pulsing in arrhythmic patches. He stood in the assembly area and didn't look at her. She didn't look at him either. She was cataloguing the training officer's expression as he marked completion times, and the expression told her something the briefing document hadn't. That her time was not expected. That second fastest was not the number that had been assigned to her in any prior projection. And he didn't say anything to her. He just made his notation. But she saw his pupils contract, not wide for thinking, but narrow, which was, she had read in her study of Valthari behavioral signaling, the expression of a revised assessment. She filed that too. By day 6, 9 candidates had been eliminated, not all at once, one after another, at different points in different exercises, in ways that were sometimes obvious and sometimes weren't. One Sorvai candidate failed a psychological stability assessment that the Academy administered during what had appeared to be a rest period. The questions were embedded in a standard nutrition consultation. This and 3 wrong answers triggered a quiet notification to the training staff that was invisible to everyone except the candidate who was quietly called aside afterward and came back to the dormitory to pack. She watched all of it. She said very little. Velkas fell into the pattern of walking with her between exercises, not deliberately, or rather, deliberately in the Kashari way that didn't acknowledge itself as deliberate, just present, adjacent. She started to understand that this was how the Kashari expressed something close to alliance. The psychological integration test, he said on day 5, walking beside her in the corridor between the combat assessment block and the sleep deprivation evaluation period. You passed it. You passed it too. I was trained for it. I knew what to look for. He was quiet for a moment. The embedded questions in the nutrition form, the ones about resource allocation under scarcity. You answered them differently from everyone else in our intake group. She looked at him. You were tracking everyone's answers. Yes. No apology for this. Kashari didn't apologize for being observant. Most candidates answered based on survival priority matrices. Protect your own life first. Complete the mission second. Secondary casualties acceptable. This is the standard outcome of most military training. He paused. You answered the inverse. Not the inverse, she said. Just not on the same axis. He looked at her. The questions assumed you were in the scenario alone, she said, or that the others in the scenario were resources. I didn't read them that way. How did you read them? She thought about the bookshop. At about 4 generations of her family building something word by word, book by book, on the premise that the most durable things were made together. About her grandmother's hand over hers. About Ambassador Velthan, who had written that she was the most dangerous thing he'd encountered and meant it kindly. As a team problem, she said. Every scenario they gave was solvable with better cooperation, and worse if you tried to solve it alone. That wasn't an accident. They were testing whether you'd see the cooperation angle. She looked at him. Did you see it? I answered both axes simultaneously, he said. My training accommodates dual frame analysis. Which is why you passed. She almost smiled. I passed because I only saw one frame, the cooperation one, and turned out that was the right one for that test. Velkas processed this for a long moment. Your survival strategy, he said, relies heavily on reading systems correctly before committing to an approach. Yes, this is not a physical strategy. No, you are aware, he said carefully, that the second cycle has a physical aptitude gauntlet that has eliminated 40% of all candidates historically, including several who were performing excellently on cognitive metrics. I've read the historical data. And? She looked ahead, at the corridor that ended in the door to the sleep deprivation block behind which 36 hours of continuous evaluation waited. And I'll deal with the physical gauntlet when I get to the physical gauntlet, she said. Right now, I'm dealing with this. Velkas made a sound she'd started to recognize as Kashari, for that is either wisdom or denial, and I cannot determine which. She pushed the door open. On day 8, the training officers did something that wasn't in any documentation she'd read. They put her in a room alone and told her to wait. That was it. Just wait. No timer visible, no stated purpose, no parameters. She sat in the room. Bare walls, one chair, no window, the floor hum present. And she waited. The first hour was fine, the second hour was fine. By the third hour, her brain had completed its survey of every inch of the room approximately 40 times and was filing a formal protest about the situation. She recognized this, not the room specifically, but the technique. She'd read about sensory ambiguity protocols in military psychology texts, the way the human brain, deprived of structured input, started generating its own, and the way that generation was often less pleasant than actual input. She also recognized something else. The way her mind, left unoccupied, went home. Not consciously, not as a choice. Just the bookshop appearing in the empty room. The smell of it. Her grandmother's voice. The weight of the admission letter in her jacket pocket, which she still carried, folded and slightly worn at the creases now. She took it out. She'd read it so many times the ink was starting to blur at the edges. Candidate Zara Ose, human, provisional admission, first cycle evaluation, no accommodations. Standard conditions apply, no accommodations. She had never wanted accommodations. And she had never been looking for a door that was propped open for her. She had been looking for a door that was closed, and a set of rules that applied equally to everyone, and the confidence that if she met the rules, she would get through the door. That was all. That had always been all. She folded the letter back, put it in her pocket, pressed it once against her ribs. The door opened at hour 4. The training officer, Velthari, young by their standards, with the particular stillness of someone who had been watching through the observation port the entire time, looked at her for a long moment. "What did you do?" he said. "For 4 hours, in an empty room." "Thought," she said. "About what?" "About why I'm here." He looked at her the way Serevos had looked at the paper with her handwritten application, like someone revising a number. "Room protocol is a psychological assessment," he said. "Most candidates spend the first hour attempting to identify a hidden objective, the second hour engaging in self-evaluation spirals, the third hour showing visible stress indicators." He paused. "You showed none of those." "I know what I'm doing here," she said. "When you know that, waiting is just waiting." He wrote something in his notation pad. She couldn't read it. She didn't need to. She was reading it in his pupils. narrowed, revised. She got up, walked past him into the corridor, kept going. 12 days, 8 done, 4 to go. Scared with somewhere to be. The physical gauntlet arrived on day 10 without ceremony. No dramatic announcement, no speech from the Archon. Just a notification on the dormitory screen at 0300 station time, which was not morning because the Academy didn't organize itself around morning. That said, physical integration assessment. Immediate assembly. Full candidate group. 39 candidates left. 9 gone in 10 days, and the gauntlet hadn't even started yet. Zara was already awake. She'd been awake for 2 hours, which was not insomnia, but preparation. She'd started waking at 103 days into orientation, after noticing that the training schedule clustered its hardest assessments between 300 and 700, the station's equivalent of early morning, where circadian rhythms for most species hit their lowest point. She couldn't change her biology's preference for daylight. She could refuse to let it catch her off guard. She dressed in the standard issue training kit, a matte black material that the Academy provided to all candidates, which was temperature regulating and pressure resistant and had been designed for an average Valthari body, meaning it fit her the way things designed for a different species always fit. Close enough in some places, wrong in others. A constant low-grade reminder that this environment had not been built with her in mind. She had never once found this discouraging. She found it clarifying, actually. An environment built for her would have had her own edges built in. This one was the real shape of the challenge, unpadded, and she preferred to know what she was working with. The gauntlet was a physical course run through the station's outer hull maintenance corridors, a space that was not pressurized to the same standard as the interior, that experienced direct thermal fluctuation from Karath 9 at a rate of approximately 12 degrees variance per hour, and that had been fitted with a series of obstacles the training documentation described with characteristic Valthari economy as relevant physical challenges. They were not wrong. They just had a different definition of relevant. The course involved a continuous heavy load carry, 60 kilograms in a pressure-sealed pack, over a distance that was presented at the start as 8 kilometers and revised at the 4-kilometer mark to 12. Because the Academy considered accurate information about endpoints a form of assistance and didn't offer assistance. It involved 3 wall climbs of varying incline, fitted with handholds calibrated for Valthari hand anatomy, which meant that the grips were spaced for fingers longer than human fingers, and set at intervals that assumed a reach Zara didn't have. It involved 2 river crossings, not water, but a pressurized fluid channel running through the hull maintenance system, ice temperature, with a current that the officer described as moderate, with a straightness of face that suggested different species had different opinions on what moderate meant. And it ended with a combat assessment solo against a training drone calibrated to the candidate's own assessed physical level. This last part was the piece that had eliminated 40% of historical candidates. Not the carry, not the climbs, the drone. Because by the time you reached the drone, you'd been carrying 60 kilograms for 12 kilometers in thermal fluctuation through corridors designed for a different body. And the drone's calibration, whatever it had measured at your physical peak, was meeting what you had left. And what you had left, after all of that, was the question. Zara had been running through contingencies for the wall climbs since day 3. The grip spacing was the variable she couldn't train around, because there was no training that would lengthen her fingers or extend her reach. So she'd been watching every Valthari training officer she encountered. So specifically the way they moved on inclined surfaces, not the hand positions, but the foot positions, the angle of hip relative to wall, the distribution of load. Valthari climbed with their hands as primary, long fingers, strong grip, pulling weight upward. She climbed with her feet as primary, shorter reach, better push than pull, and a lower center of gravity than most of the other candidates in the group by a significant margin. This was not a strategy she'd invented. It was something she'd read in a mountaineering text in her mother's archive, written by a human climber who'd figured out, in the absence of the equipment everyone else had, that you worked with the body you had, not the body the route assumed. The first wall, she went up the outside of the intended handhold line, using the structural joins between panels as footholds, slower than the Vilethari approach. But she got up. The second wall, steeper. The structural joins were spaced wider. She went up the center, both hands on the lowest rung of the handhold line and both feet pushing off the wall face at a 70-degree angle, and she moved like something that had decided physics was a suggestion rather than a rule, and she got up. The third wall stopped her. She hung on the face of it at about 2/3 height, both hands on a grip that was the wrong size for her, feet flat against the surface, and her arms telling her very specifically that they had given what they had, and the rest of this conversation was going to need to be conducted with someone else. She didn't move for 30 seconds. Several meters to her right, and she could hear the scrape of Velkas ascending. He was faster on the walls than anyone, the bioelectric field apparently giving him additional grip sensitivity, and he moved like he was reading the wall the way she read rooms. She didn't look. Looking was a waste. She looked at her hands instead. The grips were wrong for her fingers. The spacing was wrong for her reach. The wall had not been designed with her anatomy in mind. None of this was news. She shifted her left hand one grip to the side, which put her in a diagonal rather than a straight line. The diagonal was technically longer, but it cut the reach demand between each movement by 6 centimeters, and 6 centimeters was the difference between a stretch that tore and a stretch that held. She moved diagonally, up and to the left, and then up and to the right, of finding the line that worked for the body she had, and it was slower. And it looked wrong, and it was the only way she was getting to the top. She got to the top. She lay flat on the upper platform for exactly 10 seconds. Heart rate in a range her high school PE teacher would have described with some excitement. Her arms were informing her that they were filing a grievance to be addressed at a later date. Later. She got up. The fluid channel crossing was cold in the way that Zara, who had grown up in a warm city on a warm part of a warm planet, had never personally experienced before arriving at the academy. Cold as a physical argument. Cold as something that wanted to have a different outcome than she did. She went in. Most candidates crossed using a parallel bar structure spanning the channel. Arms extended, hand over hand. That legs dangling in the current. This worked for species with the upper body mass to keep their center of gravity above the current's pull. Zara was not one of those species. At 2/3 across the bar structure, the current caught her legs and she felt the pull redistribute her weight in a direction that was not the direction she was trying to go. Her grip was strong. She had been doing grip strengthening exercises since she was 20, specifically for this. But strong enough was a moving target, and the current had opinions. She let go with one hand. Not accidentally, deliberately. She let one hand go, swung her body down and into the current instead of fighting against it, and in the half-second of freefall, she got her feet onto the channel floor. There was a floor. She'd known there was a floor. She'd clocked the depth on approach, and she pushed off sideways, momentum redirection, and came up on the far bank in a combination of water, cold, and a personal relationship with gravity that she'd just had to renegotiate under pressure. She stood on the far bank, soaking, temperature somewhere in the area of very much an issue. The training officer at the checkpoint looked at her with the expression she was starting to collect. The narrowed pupils, the revised assessment, the notation in the pad. She kept moving. The drone was waiting at the end of the course in a chamber that smelled like ion discharge and the particular metallic note of a machine that had been running through combat routines against other candidates and was, she understood, now calibrated to her. Her physical peak assessment, measured during the first 3 days, run through an algorithm, adjusted for the degradation of 12 kilometers and 3 walls and 2 crossings and 60 kilograms of carried weight. The drone was approximately what she had left, which turned out to be less than she'd hoped and more than she'd feared, which was a summary of most situations she'd been in. She looked at it for a long moment. The drone was not a robot in any cinematic sense. It was a pressure-armored strike unit designed to test combat response, not to kill, though the distinction was more philosophical than physical at the ends of its operating range. It had been calibrated to be beatable. Not easily, but beatable. The assessment wasn't to win. She'd figured this out on day 4, when she'd been watching the training officers watching a combat simulation and had noticed which candidates they tracked with the most attention. Not the ones winning. The ones making decisions under pressure. The ones who adapted mid-sequence. The ones who, when what they were doing wasn't working, stopped doing it and tried something else. The Vailthari didn't care about victory. They cared about problem-solving under conditions that made problem-solving very unpleasant. The drone moved first. She moved second, which she'd been taught her whole life was a disadvantage and had somewhere along the way decided was a different kind of information. Moving second meant she saw the drone's attack vector before she committed to her response. It was a sweep pattern designed for candidates her height. She stepped into it instead of away from it, counterintuitive, wrong in the way that the grammar rule said was more expressive for being wrong. And she got inside the sweep, too close for the sweep to have any purchase, and she got one hand on the drone's shoulder joint and redirected its momentum 90 degrees sideways. It didn't go down. It wasn't supposed to go down on that move. She knew that. But she'd moved it. She'd moved it, which meant she knew it could be moved, which meant she knew what she was working with. 12 minutes. She didn't win. The technical outcome was a draw. She was still standing. The drone had been redirected and disrupted, but not disabled, and the timer ran out before either of those facts changed. She stood in the middle of the chamber, breathing like she was having an argument with her own lungs, and she looked at the training officer in the observation bay. He was looking at her. She waited. "Draw," he said. She nodded. Already knew. "Your redirection technique on the initial sweep vector." He paused. "Where did you learn that?" "I adapted it," she said, "from a judo principle. The idea that the opponent's momentum is information, not opposition." He was quiet. "Is that not—" "It is not a technique in our curriculum," he said. "We do not teach it." "I know. Most candidates attempt to overpower the drone's opening sequence. The physical disparity assessment between your weight class and the drone's is such that overpowering it wasn't going to work," she said. "So I tried the thing that might." He looked at her for a long time. Then he wrote something in his pad, longer than usual, several lines. She didn't ask what. Day 12 arrived the way endings always arrived, not differently, just finitely. The same corridors, the same floor hum, the same copper-tasting air. But 39 had become 27, and the orientation documentation had delivered what it promised. Everything that wasn't actually there was gone. The final orientation assessment was not physical, was not cognitive, was not psychological in any framework she had a name for. They put all 27 remaining candidates in a chamber with Archon Ceravos, and he stood in the center of it and looked at them for a very long time without saying anything. Then he said, "Tell me why you're here." Not strategically, not in the way of a question that had a correct answer that would be scored, and in the way of a question that genuinely didn't know what it was going to get. Candidates answered: duty, honor, service, legacy. The answers were well-formed and meant, and he listened to each one with an attention that made each candidate feel specifically seen. He got to Zara last. She was aware that he had looked at her the same way he'd looked at the cream paper in his office, as a thing that didn't fit cleanly into any category he already had. She was also aware that she'd been watching him for 12 days and had a fairly complete model of what he valued. She could have given him an answer that fit his value system. She was good enough at reading systems to do that. She gave him the true one instead. "I'm here," she said, "because for 6 years I was told I wasn't ready. And I kept thinking, ready for what? For someone to look at what I actually am and decide? Or ready to already be the thing they expected to see?" She paused. "I don't want to be what was expected. I want to be worth the revision." Serevos looked at her. His pupils went fully black. Not the black of uncertainty, the black of hard cognitive work. The black of a model being rebuilt from the ground up. "Orientation is complete," he said, still looking at her. "First cycle begins in 3 days. Those 3 days are your recovery window." He looked around the room. "You have all earned them." He walked out. Velkas was standing 2 positions to her left. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The scale plate shift, the Kashari equivalent, was there. She looked down at her hands, still slightly pruned from the fluid channel, still slightly shaking from the drone chamber 20 hours ago. She pressed them flat against her thighs. Worth the revision. 3 days. Then the actual training started. She'd been waiting 6 years for 3 more days. This was nothing. This was everything. The first cycle lasted 8 months. 8 months measured in things Zara hadn't known she had until they were tested. A threshold for cold she didn't know her body maintained, a clarity of thinking under sleep deprivation that surprised her less than it surprised the training staff, and a relationship with failure that she would not have been able to articulate before the academy, but could now locate precisely. Failure was information she hadn't had before, and information was never wasted. 27 candidates went into the first cycle. 14 came out. She was one of them. Velkas was another. 3 Kashari total, which was historically strong for their intake. 4 Sorvai. The 2 Dravathi were both gone. One in the 3rd month during an endurance protocol, one in the 5th during a tactical decision assessment that required a flexibility of approach his training had not included. She'd watched him go and felt something that wasn't satisfaction and wasn't grief, but was close to both. The recognition that a system built to identify what was actually there had done exactly that, and that what was actually there sometimes wasn't enough, and that this was not a judgment and not an end, just a fact about the shape of things. She had her own 3rd month crisis. She did not call it a crisis at the time, but she recognized it in retrospect. A 2-week stretch in the middle of the endurance protocol where she had lost, temporarily and specifically, the thread of why. Not confidence. She'd expected to lose confidence and had a system for that. The letter in her pocket, the floor hum as a constant, Velkas's adjacent deliberate presence in the corridors. She'd been prepared for confidence to wobble. What she hadn't been prepared for was the way the academy stripped context. Not maliciously, structurally. There was no news from outside, no contact with family during evaluation periods, no frame of reference that extended beyond the station and the dying star and the 26 other people who were also trying to exist under conditions that had been carefully designed to be almost too much. She had gone, and on a Tuesday by station reckoning, from fine to not fine in the space of a meal she couldn't taste. She had sat in her bay that night and held the letter and found, for the first time, that the letter wasn't enough. The words were there. The seal was there. But the thread was frayed and she couldn't feel the person who had put the letter in her pocket. She thought about her grandmother for a long time. She thought about what it meant to do a thing that no one in your context had done before. The particular texture of being first, which was not triumphant, that was a story told after. But while happening was mostly the experience of not having anyone who'd already done it to call. She wrote a letter she couldn't send. Long. Longer than she'd written since the academy took her pen and paper and replaced them with training documentation and assessment reports. She wrote to her grandmother about the floor hum, and the wrong spectrum light, and the wall climbs, and the thing that happened when you held 60 kilograms for 12 kilometers and discovered that your body's limit was not where you'd placed it. She wrote about Velkas and the way Kashari expressed alliance by existing next to you. She wrote about the drone and the judo principle and the revised pupils expression. She wrote, "I think I understand now why they built it around a dying star. Everything here is happening at the edge of what's possible. The star is proof that edge states can last a very long time." She folded the letter, kept it with the admission letter in her pocket. and 2 pieces of paper, both worn at the creases. The next morning, she got up, got dressed, went to training. The second cycle was different from the first in a way that took her 2 months to name. In the first cycle, the academy was testing whether you would break. In the second, it was testing what you built when you didn't. This was, she thought, the thing that most of the documentation missed. The way the Vailthari curriculum operated, not as a selection mechanism for physical capacity, but as a construction project. They were not looking for people who survived their training. They were looking for people who, having survived it, came out with something additional. A particular quality of decision-making that only existed on the other side of having been tested past the point of certainty. The second cycle introduced something called integrated scenario assessment, which was the Academy's term for situations in which no prepared response was correct, and the required output was improvisation under pressure. Not tactical improvisation. That was fourth cycle. This was something more foundational. The ability to encounter a problem for which no training existed and find an approach anyway. Zara was, she understood for the first time with her whole self, rather than just her preparation notes, constitutionally built for this. Not because she was brilliant. She was good, not brilliant. She had long ago made a clear-eyed assessment of the difference. Velkas was brilliant. 2 of the Sorvai candidates were brilliant in different ways. She was good, thorough, fast, steady, better under pressure than not. What she had that overlapped with her goodness was the 6 years. 6 years of preparing for a system she didn't fully have access to. 6 years of working with incomplete information and building models from the pieces available. 6 years of being refused and treating the refusal as a technical problem rather than a verdict. That practice, of improvising with what was available toward a goal that hadn't confirmed it was reachable, was not a skill she'd developed. It was the architecture she'd been building in for years, without knowing it would be specifically useful here. The improvisation scenarios didn't feel like tests. They felt like Tuesday, like the ordinary texture of her entire adult life, with better equipment. Her scores in the second cycle were the highest in her intake group. Not highest overall in the Academy's current cohort. There were upper cycle candidates with 4 additional years of training who operated at levels she was still years away from. But in her group, highest. The training officer who had monitored her gauntlet performance, she had never learned his name because Vailthari training staff did not introduce themselves to first cycle candidates, which was itself a test of something, stopped her in the corridor after her 3rd improvisation scenario score was posted. "Candidate Osei," he said. She stopped. "Yes. Your approach in the supply chain crisis scenario, the resource redistribution model you developed. Yes. It does not exist in our curriculum." "I know. It appears to be an adaptation of an economic principle from Earth's trading history. Our human colonial period." She looked at him. He had, apparently, done some research. "My family are booksellers," she said. "We had a lot of economic history." He processed this. The approach was not optimal by conventional tactical metrics. It was, however, effective at the scenario's actual objective, which most candidates missed. He paused. "Most candidates optimized for resource control. You optimized for collective function. Resource control doesn't help if the collective stops functioning," she said. The objective was to maintain operational capacity. Individual resources don't matter if the system they support collapses. He was quiet for a moment. His pupils were doing the thing. "Your grandmother," he said, "the one whose letter is in your pocket." She went very still. Not startled. She'd known they observed, or had always known. But hearing it named directly was different. "She is a factor in your performance profile," he said. "Not as a distraction, as a structural element." He looked at her with the expression that was not a Vailthari expression she could find in any behavioral chart. Something outside the documented range. Our training methodology is built on the principle of isolation. Strip external context. Create pure performance conditions. This is 11,000 years of evidence-based practice. He paused. You are the first candidate in my experience whose performance in isolation has been demonstrably supplemented by the presence of a letter. She'd be pleased to hear that. I am not sure it is a compliment. She'd be pleased anyway. Zara looked at him levelly. She told me that brave is just scared with somewhere to be. You know, I've been somewhere to be for 6 years. That doesn't go away because the context does. He wrote in his pad. Long, several lines. She had learned not to look away when he wrote. The act of watching him write was its own kind of record, her own notation. He finished, looked up. Highest integrated scenario scores in your intake cycle, he said. Congratulations, candidate. He walked away. She stood in the corridor for a moment, alone with the floor hum, with Karath 9 pulsing its slow patience through the hull, with 2 worn letters in her jacket pocket. Then she walked to the next session. The end of the second cycle brought the class down to 9. 9 from 63, which was, she checked the math, 14.3%, which was more than double the historical graduation rate. Which meant either this was an exceptional class or the historical data had some variance she hadn't accounted for, and in either case, she was still in it. Still in it. She wrote that in the unsendable letter that night. Still in it. 9 left. Still in it. Velkas sat across from her in the common area where the 9 remaining candidates had, by unspoken agreement, begun existing in each other's presence more than they had before. Not conversation exactly, presence. The particular quality of silence between people who had been through the same impossible corridor and recognized each other on the other side. The third cycle, Velkas said. He was looking at the star through the observation port. Karath 9's slow red burning, patient and immense and completely indifferent to opinions about its timeline. I know, she said. It is the cycle with the highest historical elimination rate. I know. 41% of all who reach it do not complete it. I know. He was quiet. The star burned. You are going to complete it, he said. Not a question. Also, not a prediction. The Kashari didn't make predictions about things with significant uncertainty, as a cultural principle. Something else. Something that sat between a prediction and a decision. She looked at him. You don't know that. No, he said, but I know that you have been building toward this for 6 years with incomplete information, using tools not designed for you, in a system that did not expect you. That is not a profile that stops at the third cycle. She looked out at the star. We don't have a word, Velkas said, in primary Kashari, for the quality you have. Not the endurance. Everyone here has endurance, not the intelligence. The specific quality of a being who has been told repeatedly that a thing is not for them, and has responded to this information by continuing. He paused. We don't have a word, because it is not a quality we have encountered frequently enough to name. She thought about her grandmother naming things, about the bookshop and the long shelves of other people's words, and the fact that naming was how humanity had always worked. If you couldn't find the word, you made it, or you borrowed it, or you held the space where it should be and kept going until something arrived. We might not have a word for it either, she said. Not exactly. What do you call it? She thought for a long time. Home, she said. We call it home. The place you keep going back to, even when someone's locked the door. Velkas processed this. She watched his scale plate do the shift. Home, he said slowly, like he was measuring the weight of it. That is not a tactical concept. No, she said, it's a survival one. Archon Serevos reviewed her file at the end of the second cycle, as he reviewed all files in the particular quiet of his office with Karath 9 filling the observation glass behind him. He had been running the academy for 61 years. He had seen 17,000 candidates. He had graduated, by personal count, 1,012. He read her file 3 times. Then he called Vice Archon Dhala. The human candidate, he said. I know, Dhala said, without looking up from her own screen. Sir, her improvisation scores. I know. The economic model she developed in the supply chain scenario, the redirection technique from the physical assessment, the room protocol performance. He set the file down. She is using things we have not taught her, not augmented by things we have not taught her using. The things we didn't teach her are her primary instruments. Darla finally looked up. You sound surprised. I am. You admitted her. I admitted her because she applied correctly 6 years in a row, and the criteria were met, and it would have been discrimination to refuse her. He looked at the file again. I did not admit her because I expected this. What did you expect? He was honest, which was what Valthari were under all their architecture. I expected a capable candidate who would not survive the first cycle. A data point, a demonstration that humans were not yet at the level required. He paused. I expected to be right in a way that was respectful and unambiguous. And instead, she is in the top 3 performance profiles of the entire current cohort, using techniques derived from Earth economic history, and she carries letters in her pocket, Darla. She is performing at this level partly because of letters she cannot send. Darla was quiet for a moment. That is a human thing. I have never encountered it as a performance mechanism, because we don't train for it. We train for isolation and internal resource development. We have always assumed that external context was a vulnerability, something to be stripped away so that genuine capacity could be assessed. She looked at the file in his hand. She appears to be running external context not as a vulnerability, but as an additional power source. Serevos set the file down. She's not different from us in the ways we thought, he said slowly. She's different in ways we didn't think to measure. Through the observation glass, Karath 9 burned its slow and patient burn, dying on its own timeline. Still, in the meanwhile, producing more energy than most stars managed at their peak. She has 2 cycles left, Tala said. Yes. If she graduates? Yes. What do we do with a human graduate, Serevos? In 11,000 years, we have no protocol for... We do, he said. What we do with every graduate. He picked up the file again. We learn from them. He looked at the seal at the top of her application, reproduced in her file. The Valthari sigil, what survives the forge. And then we revise what we thought the forge was for. Outside, the star pulsed. Patient. Immense. Full of the particular conviction of a thing that has been burning longer than anyone expected and intends to keep going. Zara Osei was in the dormitory, asleep for the first time in 3 days, with 2 folded letters against her ribs. In the morning, she would begin the 3rd cycle. She would not be ready. She was never going to be ready, because ready was the thing the door assumed you were before it opened, and she had long ago decided to be the thing that walked through doors before they were ready for her. In 11,000 years of the Valthari Academy, no human had ever graduated. In 11,000 years of the Valthari Academy, no human had ever tried. The difference, as Nana Adwa might have said, would say someday when the letters arrived, was not as large as everyone had assumed. It was, in fact, the size of a girl who knew exactly where she was going and had somewhere to be.